Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 for PC, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Switch. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a hybrid of several genres, including the fighting game, role-playing game, and adventure game genre, but it's primarily an action-adventure game, and it was the sequel to Dragon Ball Xenoverse. It's developed by Dimps and published by Bandai Namco back in 2016 for PS4, Xbox One, and PC, and it was released on Switch the following year. And it was generally better received than its predecessor, although that was before all of the DLC updates came along and messed with the balancing a bit. So let's go ahead and actually start delving into this thing and find out whether it is actually an improvement over its predecessor, or whether something else entirely happened. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's not really anything on display here that wasn't on display in the original game, although there are some very slight improvements here and there, mostly with regards to shaders and the improvements made to the animations, namely there being a lot more of them this time around than what you saw in the original game. And while none of it is really impressive in terms of its technical achievements or just being stellar graphics, it fits in well with what you would expect from Dragon Ball, considering the art style and the way that the animations play out. And of course, it's all bright and colorful, which makes it much more appealing than a lot of other games out there. And on top of all of that, the interface did get some improvements as well, so now it looks cleaner and much more professional than what you saw in the original game. And of course, it does run at a very smooth 60 frames per second all the time, so they've done pretty much everything they need to ensure a very smooth playing experience that looks and feels like Dragon Ball, except for maybe go further into the technical side of things, but let's face it, they don't really need to do that. Would have been nice if they had improved the lip syncing though, because it's still terrible in this, even when you put it to the Japanese voiceovers, so they definitely didn't do a good job with the lip sync, but everything else looks fine. So overall, the visuals are pretty much the same as the first game, with some very slight, almost non-noticeable improvements, but then you move over into sound design, that's where things get a bit better. Most of the sound effects are pretty much the same as the first game, although they did tweak some of the mixing a bit to make them a bit better, and the voice acting is much the same as the original game, which is to say that it's just Dragon Ball voice acting, which means it's really not that great. But then you go into the music, and that's where they made some very noticeable improvements. Because you may remember from my review of Dragon Ball Xenoverse that the music in that game was one of the really nasty problems with the presentation, particularly when you got to the main menu and the character select and all that sort of thing, and it had this really obnoxious, really repetitive piano tune that did not get you psyched up for anything. And it was a sign of things to come, because the rest of the soundtrack was fairly wimpy. But then you get to Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2, and you know things are going to be different when you start the game up and it greets you at the main menu with some hard rock. It's like the developers actually sat down and thought to themselves, okay, what music is appropriate for something as utterly ridiculous as Dragon Ball? And they came up with the correct answer of a hell of a lot of hard rock and metal. That's not to say that the entire soundtrack is hard rock and metal. They do reuse some tracks from the original game, including that infuriating piano tune during the CGI intro, but other than that, most of the tracks they reuse are not too bad, and the other tracks that are not hard rock and metal are at least some electronic stuff that's mostly alright, although they do have a few stinkers in there as well. Regardless, the point is that they did make improvements to the soundtrack, so that does help things out quite a bit in the long run, and overall the presentation, while it's not a massive step up from the previous game, does have a few noticeable improvements in a couple of key areas. But here's the thing, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is almost exactly the same as Dragon Ball Xenoverse 1. You play as a time patroller, although not the same one as in the original game, and you are contacted by Elder Kai, who tells you that the timeline has been altered and you need to go back in time to fix it, which means that you're going through pretty much the exact same process you did in the original Dragon Ball Xenoverse. You go back to various periods in Dragon Ball history and you correct the timeline by beating the living crap out of certain characters. Both Mira and Towa from the previous Dragon Ball Xenoverse game return as the antagonists for this one, and they're up to pretty much the exact same scheme as they were in Dragon Ball Xenoverse. The only major difference is that there's a specific MacGuffin that Mira and Towa are both trying to get in order to gain immeasurable power and thus merge the demon world and everything else, and you know the drill at this point if you've played Xenoverse 1. It's really just an excuse to have you go through the various periods of Dragon Ball history and fight alongside and against the series' iconic characters. There's really nothing going on in terms of the actual story of the game, and as a result, it just ends up falling flat. Not to mention that the storytelling itself is actually kind of insulting to your intelligence. I mean, as surprised as the characters are when certain things are revealed, it's painfully obvious that they're either completely incompetent or just completely stupid, and you're just having to go along for the ride because they're too stupid to figure out what is painfully obvious. To give you a prime example, there's the so-called Masked Saiyan, who is this mysterious henchman of Mira and Towa who always seems to show up, wreak havoc, and then leave. And you take one look at the guy, and you know who it is right from the get-go, because they show it to you in the intro cutscene when you start the game, so you have to sit there and go, okay, why did we play this up the entire game when we already know exactly who this character is? Is it basically just to prove that everyone else in the game is a complete idiot or something? Because that's basically what that tells you. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't expect anything remotely resembling even decent storytelling out of Dragon Ball, but this is just insulting. If they ever make a Xenoverse 3, they've got to do one of two things to actually make the story mode worth playing through. First is actually put real effort into making a unique storyline in the Dragon Ball universe, or if they're so insistent upon going back through history and just continuing to repeat the same things over and over again, just make it a mission-based structure as opposed to having an actual overarching storyline. Because that's basically what the game is anyway. You primarily are going on the parallel quests because they're gameplay focused, and of course you had to go through the story to unlock most of those, so you end up going on the story just to unlock gameplay mechanics. So why not skip the story mode and go for a more freeform approach where they just give you a bunch of missions you can go on, and you select which ones you want to do in whatever order you want to do them in, and you just do them that way. I mean, the argument you could make against that is the idea of you're training up to get better and better and better so you can deal with the more advanced threats that you get to when you get to the higher levels. But even then, just make a bunch of missions that are appropriate for whatever level you currently are, and just go from there. Because as it stands, the story just falls completely flat, and you end up falling to the gameplay to bring things up. And luckily, that's where the vast majority of improvements made to Dragon Ball Xenoverse lie, because they completely overhauled several of the systems in this game. I'm not going to go over what was already in the base game that was basically just ported over, except for to tell you a bit how they're different. For example, the basic combo system has actually been improved pretty significantly, so now that instead of just having basically 2 combos, now you actually have quite a few of them to mess around with, and they're considerably longer and more detailed than what you saw in the original game. And they change very significantly depending on what character race you're playing. So if you're playing a Saiyan, they're going to be very different from an Earthling, or a Majin, or a Namekian, or a Frieza race character. And all of the character races are viable as opposed to what you saw in Xenoverse 1, where there was really no reason to play anything but a Saiyan because they had Super Saiyan, which allowed them to basically infinitely spam ultimate attacks. Not only is that not the case in Xenoverse 2, they've actually completely overhauled how the transformations work. So for one, in order to get Super Saiyan, not only do you have to actually be a Saiyan, but you have to go on a specific mission in order to actually unlock the ability to go Super Saiyan. And when you get Super Saiyan, it has different tiers of activation. So you start out at Super Saiyan 1, and then once you get up to a certain number of key bars, then you get Super Saiyan 2, and even further than that, once you get to another level of key bars, you can get Super Saiyan 3. And unlike in Xenoverse 1, where Super Saiyan basically allowed you to spam ultimates because you had infinite Super and Ultimate usage while your Super Saiyan form was active, in Super Saiyan mode in Xenoverse 2, you still use your key bars whenever you use a Super or an Ultimate, and your key regeneration rate is slowed down pretty heavily. But unlike in the original game, you don't just pop out of Super Saiyan mode when your key bar bottoms out. You just can't use any supers or ultimates at that point until you recharge your ki. So now transformations work on a sense of, as long as you have enough ki to activate them in the first place, you can maintain that transformation indefinitely. And now you're not punished for playing anything but a Super Saiyan, because not only do Super Saiyans get transformations, but everyone has access to transformations in some form or another. In fact, one of the best transformations in the game is called Potential Unleashed, and it's available regardless of what your character's race is. You can use it whether you're a Saiyan Saiyan or an Earthling or whatever, really. So they fixed one of the biggest balancing issues in the game by doing that, and then they went on to make other improvements as well. They changed the way stats and equipment work, so now the bonuses and detriments granted by them are very minimal, so you can very easily offset various penalties in your equipment with various stat boosts, and of course there's also the ability to use QQ bangs, which basically overwrite whatever your equipment stats are and allow you to choose whatever you want just for a visual state, as opposed to having to pick your equipment based on whatever stats you wanted to boost. They also changed the way that training with the various masters works, so now as long as you are an appropriate level in order to actually get whatever skill they're offering, you can just go right up to them, ask for them to train, and they'll allow you to get that ability right off the bat. And the way you increase your training level is by going on advancement tests, which basically are just very short parallel quest kind of things that allow you to beat the crap out of a bunch of enemies, and if you do well in them and succeed, then you go up in rank. So you can effectively get to a pretty maximum rank relatively quickly and just go through all of the master training in one pretty quick succession. For example, if you really want Final Flash and you don't want to go through all of Vegeta's training first, all you have to do is get up to the appropriate training level in order to get Final Flash, and then you just go train with him the 4 times you need to get to Final Flash, and then that's it. You don't need to drag him along, you don't need to constantly level up your friendship with him. You just need to go and do those 4 missions, and then you're done. And the same is true for all of the masters that are available in the game, of which there are more than what you saw in Xenoverse 1, which means more abilities to use, and that actually reduces the grind pretty significantly. They even dramatically improved the drop rates, so now you don't have to sit there and grind for hours and hours and hours on the same missions just to get the one thing you want. Now it's actually pretty strange if you don't get that ability you wanted within the first maybe 3 attempts. Again, like with the masters, this reduces the grind dramatically and makes it much easier to actually enjoy the game because you can just select whatever abilities you want and just mess around with them. Not to mention that it's actually faster to level up in this game than it was in the original game, so that helps things out a fair bit as well. Now, of course, once you hit high levels, it starts to slow down to a crawl, but at that point, you've got enough TP medals and Zenny to where it doesn't really matter, because you can spend your TP medals in order to actually just purchase level ups. And you may think there'd be plenty of opportunity for some DLC crap there, but oddly enough, no. The TP medals are actually just gained by completing quests. And as long as you didn't spend anything in the TP medal shop where you can buy various abilities and equipment, you probably have plenty to get to maximum level relatively quickly. And oddly enough, buying levels isn't only an endgame thing. You can actually do that at any point. It's just that once you hit a certain level, you're only going to be spending TP medals from then on out, whereas before that you were spending Zenny, which is just the general in-game currency you earn by doing everything. So ultimately the progression is a lot faster in this than it was in Xenoverse 2, which makes it feel like much less of a slog, which is a good thing considering that a lot of what you're doing in this game is exactly the same as what you were doing in the original game. And by that I mean most of the parallel quests are actually exactly the same as they were in the original. They may have changed up the rewards here and there, but really most of the parallel quests are exactly the same as the parallel quests in the original game. It's just that they've been tweaked very, very slightly with regards to balancing and such to make them much more manageable. So with most of the things they ported over from the original game, they made a bunch of balancing tweaks and they generally improved them. But then they introduced a few new things of their own. For example, there's the Hero Coliseum, which is this kind of miniatures battle game that I didn't really mess around with too much because it was just kind of boring. But it is completely optional, so you don't need to bother with it if you don't want to. And they also introduced additional hubs beyond simply the city, which is now Kanton City instead of Toki Toki City, and is actually considerably expanded. But these additional hubs have different mechanics associated with them that will eventually grant you a time egg, which you can then, when you gathered all of them together, use to get the endgame level ups. The hubs do get a bit tedious, but ultimately they're basically endgame content anyway, so you would kind of expect it to be a bit repetitive in the long run, and since they are mainly used to get the endgame level ups, it ends up not really being that big of a deal. Because by the time you've hit that point, the only things left for you to do are the various parallel quests that you haven't already done, as well as some additional story content that was later introduced in DLCs regarding various events that go on during Dragon Ball Super. Thing is, they're not really story missions so much as they're just additional sequences of parallel quests that the game treats as a sort of additional story mode for you to do at the end game. So they feel pretty out of place as story content, but are certainly something for you to do if you want an additional challenge, because, well, when you get to the really high-level story missions and parallel quests, you end up finding out that enemies have an awful lot of super armor, and that gets very tiring very quickly. And again, it's worth noting that this was all DLC content, so if you don't have the DLCs, then there's only so much you can do with that. But even if you don't have all of the DLCs, you can still access some of the content because they introduced it in simple updates for the game as opposed to only being available in the DLC. So they did continue to add content even for free after the release of the game, which is definitely appreciated, and they did introduce quite a few updates to iron out some technical issues as well as some balancing issues that cropped up here and there. At least they did up until very recently, which I'll get to in just a moment. Because before I talk about the DLC update that basically broke the entire balancing of the game, I want to mention that they also did something very good for newcomers, which is they introduced a very extensive tutorial mode. You do get the tutorial missions in the story mode right at the beginning of the game that'll give you all the basic controls for how to do things, but then if you want more advanced lessons than that, you can go to the training area, and that will actually allow you to get more advanced tutorials on things like the stamina break, or the perfect guard, or things along those lines. This is all incredibly important for a new player because if you don't know about all of those mechanics, you'll probably sit there playing the game and wondering what the hell's going on whenever you get stamina broken, or whenever somebody gets a perfect guard, or even if you get a perfect guard and you just don't know what happened. It's all there to give you a much stronger grasp on the gameplay mechanics, and it is extremely helpful. So if I just talk about all of that, it seems like they've actually fixed pretty much everything that was wrong with Xenoverse 1, and for the most part, they actually did. It is still pretty repetitive, which is something you'd kind of expect of a game like this anyway, so that can wear on you after a while, but it's less repetitive, at least in feel, because you feel like you're progressing a lot more quickly, and you feel like there's a lot less grind than there was in the original Xenoverse. It has extensive tutorials to teach you all of the mechanics that the original game didn't teach you pretty much at all, and it has much better balancing to make all of the races viable, as opposed to the original Xenoverse where really only Saiyans were viable. And of course, on top of all of that, it has quite a bit more content than the original game. Everything from the original game returns, and on top of that, they add a bunch of new abilities, a bunch of new characters, and a bunch of new outfits, all that you can customize your character with to your heart's content. They even try to give you additional activities to do beyond simply what you're used to from the main game, the main parallel quests in the storyline. They have the hero Coliseum, they have the various hubs that have slightly different mechanics going on, and they even have the expert battles, which are basically co-op multiplayer battles where you're all going up against one very, very powerful enemy with some very special modifiers. They're not particularly great, but they are some additional content for you to mess around with, and if you want to play some co-op online, there's definitely nothing wrong with going into the expert missions and messing around with them. They're at least a bit of a refreshing change of pace, although a lot of them are pretty much unfair because that enemy has to be so ridiculously powerful that it justifies about 6 people going up against them. And that's what's ultimately going to lead me into the biggest issue the game has, which is actually related to the balancing. I've been praising the balancing up to this point, but there are certain aspects of it which allow you to create an effectively broken character for online versus, which just gets infuriating for people to deal with. And on top of that, the most recent update introduced a feature that effectively broke the entire balancing of the game, which is called a limit burst. You see, whenever you equip a Super Soul, it gives you a pretty significant boost to a certain thing. Most of the time, it has a pretty straightforward activation feature, so there are a couple that activate immediately and stay activated whenever you go into Super Saiyan mode. There are also a couple that just start at the beginning of a battle and eventually peter out over time, and there are others that will activate just whenever certain abilities are used or something along those lines. The point is that these Super Souls have pretty powerful abilities associated with them, but that update introduced the addition of limit bursts, which are also associated with the Super Souls, and these can propel your character into being so ridiculously overpowered you will win almost every single battle with one hit. Probably the most infamous one of these is the Super Soul that gives you a significant boost to Final Kamehameha, which is already one of the best ultimates in the game. But when you activate your Limit Burst with that particular Super Soul equipped, then suddenly you get a massive boost to the damage output of your Final Kamehameha, which, if you combine it with a Transform state that gives you additional Ki Blast damage, means that you can basically one-shot anything. There's another one that gives a massive boost to the Sword of Hope, and that ends up actually doing even more damage than that if you've got a Strike Super focused character. So you've got these limit bursts that basically break every single bit of balancing in the game, which means that there's really not much reason to go online with it anymore. Back before they introduced those, yeah, you could still have fairly powerful character builds that were really easy to just demolish other players with, but usually there were some ways around that. That's not really the case anymore, and as a result, the online balancing is absolutely ruined. The thing is, those limit bursts are fine in the single player because the enemy doesn't activate them, and they give you some ridiculously powerful abilities that you can use against the fairly cheaty AI, but online it's just blatantly unfair, and it basically ruins the entire balancing of the game. So if you want a much more balanced online fighting game, you're gonna have to look elsewhere. So if you treat this as a single-player and co-op game, it's actually a very significant improvement over Xenoverse 1 in pretty much every single regard, to the point where it's actually a pretty enjoyable game at times. But if you try to go into the online versus, they've just introduced way too much that just ruins the balancing of the game, and I can't recommend that on that basis. But if you want a Dragon Ball game that allows you to create your own character and level up their abilities over time, get them access to new super powerful attacks, and ultimately end up fighting off the most powerful characters in the Dragon Ball universe, then this might actually fit the bill for you. I can actually kind of recommend this as a video game. It's certainly not amazing, and it's certainly got quite a lot of room for improvement, but they've made so many drastic improvements over Xenoverse 1 that it's actually a decent game now. The thing is, it's just that. It's only decent. It's not great. It's not even particularly good. It's just they've gone from being absolute garbage to a decent enough game to where I can recommend you pick it up if you're interested anyway, at a pretty reduced price point. At the very least, do not pick this thing up for anything more than about $25 to $30. And that includes the DLC, I might add. But here's the thing, you are going to have to contend with quite a few issues. I've already mentioned all of the gameplay issues associated with the game, but there's also one in particular if you already have Xenoverse 1 and you want to import your save into Xenoverse 2 for all of the additional goodies that it gives you. Because the save import feature allows you to import your character from Xenoverse 1 with whatever abilities they had equipped at that time, and that allows you to actually use them on your own character that you create for Xenoverse 2, at least as far as certain abilities go. You can't use transformations, you can't do certain god abilities that were in Xenoverse 1. It's only supers and ultimates that are basically on the approved list, and that exists out there on the internet, so you can find that if you're interested. But the problem is that if you decide to import your save, a lot of times on PC it won't work. So there's a pretty weird workaround if it doesn't work for you, that you have to fill out all of the character slots in Xenoverse 1 with blank characters effectively, and then you can import whatever character you want from Xenoverse 1 in the main slot, and then it will finally work when you import it into Xenoverse 2. The thing is, your mileage may vary on that because the save import feature might work perfectly, or it might not work at all even if you use the workaround, or the workaround may just break your saves entirely. It can do all kinds of wacky things, so it's ultimately pretty irritating that they managed to break the save import feature. But here's the thing, I can't recommend Xenoverse 1 to anybody because it's just so crappy of a game, whereas Xenoverse 2 I can recommend at least to some degree. So it's up to you whether you want to put up with the awfulness of Xenoverse 1 to import the character into Xenoverse 2 or not. I did find that it helped my playthrough out a bit, but that's because I didn't want to go through all the crap I went through in Xenoverse 1 to get things like the maximum charge. So if you haven't played through Xenoverse 1, then it may not necessarily be that big of an issue for you. It's just something that you'll have to decide for yourself. Ultimately though, I give Xenoverse 2 a 3 out of 5. Again, it's a decent enough game that I recommend to people who are interested in it if you pick it up on sale, but only when it's on sale and only with all the DLC included. Thanks for watching.